Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. We have a bit of a different setup today. It is obviously Halloween and I absolutely love this time of year. Last year I did a goth houseplants video with a kind of a Halloween theme, and this year I wanted to try something a little bit different. Now, this video is not technically involving any plants, but it's something that I'm very interested in and I really hope that you enjoy this video. Some of you may already know that Halloween is actually an old Irish festival that used to be called Samhain. So this was an old Celtic tradition, festival, time of year that really marked the beginning of the winter season. And I still think it feels that way to me, and probably to a lot of people too, that it's not fully winter until Halloween has passed. Samhain was believed to be a night where the boundaries between the living world and the world of the dead was kind of a bit blurred. So the dead would on this night come up to the earthly realm and they would look for human souls to take. So that is why people used to dress up as something really, really scary, so that they would be seen as the dead and not the living, and so they could survive this night of Samhain. Something that I'm also very interested in that is not to do with plants is Irish folklore and scary mythology and Irish history. And one thing that I'm very interested in within Irish folklore is the Banshee or Unveiled Sí. So today I wanted to speak to you a little bit about the Banshee. What is this myth? Who is she? What does she represent? And also read some scary Banshee stories in the spirit of Halloween. So I have a cup of tea here, and I also have my favorite bat pillow. So I'm going to sit here with my pillow and I'm going to read to you some stuff about the Banshee. So grab a cup of tea, maybe do some plant chores, and I hope that you enjoy. So one of the best resources I found for this video were publications by Professor Patricia Lysett, who seems to be the woman who knows everything about the Banshee and has written many books culminating historical stories and facts on this mythical creature. The Banshee in Irish is Unveiled Sí, which directly translates as the fairy woman. So she is a fairy and Unveiled is the woman, so the fairy woman. Fairies in Irish mythology is not probably the fairy that comes to mind with the wings and all of that. They generally mean kind of spirits, and in a lot of Irish mythology, I can't speak today, I can't speak. So Unveiled Sí is known to be a spirit or a woman who is the harbinger of death. So she appears as an omen to kind of warn communities and in particular families about a death that is about to occur. She's usually signified by a keen, which is Irish and kind of means keening, which is kind of a lamenting cry, a shrieking, wailing type of cry. So she would visit a family close to or at the time of a death in that family or in that community. So obviously she didn't mean good news, okay? When people heard the Banshee, they're not always scared, but they know that something bad is about to happen and something sad in the form of a death of someone that they know is about to occur or has occurred. Accounts of what the Banshee looks like do differ across different people's experiences, but the signifying thing about her was usually the cry. People would hear the cry much more often than them actually seeing this figure, but the figure is described to be a woman wearing a grey cloak with long, dark, streaming grey hair, or grey or black hair. Some people would say that she had red eyes because she was crying and weeping so much that her eyes looked swollen and red. Some accounts do describe her as being a very tall, like abnormally tall figure, but most accounts also say that she is quite short and kind of resembles an older woman that may be seen at Irish funerals, crying over the death of a loved one. As I said earlier, the Banshee would generally appear to families, but not all families, generally families of Irish or Celtic origin. So generally then with the prefix of O or Mac. So for example, O'Sullivan or McCarthy, those kind of surnames would indicate that they are of Irish origin. Accounts of this mythological creature appearing to people actually date back as far as 1380. So that would be the 14th century, and around the same time also showed up in a lot of Norman literature at the time. So really Irish people have been experiencing the Banshee for a very long time. So growing up in Ireland, me personally at least, would hear stories about the Banshee from other people in my school, and it would be kind of a scary story that you'd hear of. Obviously, as a child, you'd be quite terrified of hearing this in the middle of the night. Generally, I remember people saying about the Banshee coming to your window. So either knocking on your window, and if you open the curtains, then she would scream in your face, which was really a terrifying image to have as a child. But I remember being really terrified about this one thing happening and never opening my curtains no matter what I heard knocking on my window at night. Generally, I found when speaking to older people that they weren't really as afraid of the Banshee as, say, I would be as a child. I think people would see her as just kind of a warning sign, telling you that something's about to happen, not something that is able to harm you or do anything of harm to you or your family. She was really just a sign, I guess, to tell you that something is about to happen. But yeah, as a school kid, I used to hear stories of people and saying it was the Banshee that called on my window, it was the Banshee that chased me down the road. I heard many stories like this growing up, not many that I can really remember in any great detail, but it was a thing that was talked about freely, and when you'd speak about it, people would know exactly what you were saying. I do have a story myself that I was kind of reluctant to share because I do think it was a figment of my own imagination as a younger person. But I think it's quite funny to tell, I guess, and might describe the culture around the Banshee and how terrifying she was to younger people and children. Near the house where I lived when I was younger, there was this abandoned house that was not too far from where I lived, probably like a 5-10 minute walk. And there were many stories. I actually don't know if any of these are true, but there were many stories about what happened at that house and why nobody lives in it now. And those stories were about the people that lived in the house that died in very sad circumstances, and so the house was abandoned. I don't know if any of that is true, and I did not research that for this video. But it was known as a place, I guess, as teenagers to hang out in. I must have been between the ages of 10 and 13, maybe, probably closer to 10. So me and my childhood friend, we used to hang out all the time together, and we decided to walk down to this house. And so we're there, we're checking stuff out, we're looking at, the derelict building and walking around the gardens, just, I don't know, doing what kids do, I guess, exploring. All of a sudden, I believe that we were probably talking about something scary, maybe even the Banshee itself. And so we were kind of getting a little bit freaked out and wanted to leave. And so as we're leaving and as we're turning around from the house, we hear a very loud, very terrifying scream. Now, I don't know if that is real or if, the childhood imagination is so powerful that I wouldn't put it past myself to have convinced myself that I heard of this, especially in the sense that we were in a scary place and we were, talking about scary stuff. But we both heard or both said that we had heard this scream. And so the immediate reaction from both of us was to run as fast as we can back home and away from this house. Now, that kind of left my memory, I guess, left my brain for many years. Until when I was a later teenager, there was a neighbour of mine who was quite an old man, and he'd written a book about growing up in the local area back in like 1920, around that time. There was works going on a hydroelectric scheme that he worked on as a young teenager, and I remember reading this book. Maybe I was around 16, 17, and in this book, which is not available online, I did try to find it. I think it was self-published. There is a story that he tells in this book about experiencing the Banshee, and in his book he is in the middle of the night woken up because the cow is calving. The cow is about to have a calf, and there's help needed immediately on the farm, which was a little bit away from where he lived. So he hops on his bike in the middle of the night. Obviously there's no lights, there's no phones back then. And he's cycling his bike as fast as he can to get to the farm. And as he's passing this very same point, which is the closest point on the road to this old abandoned building that me and my friend went to when we were young kids, and he hears an extremely loud wailing at the base of his bike, and it's screaming at him, and he feels it getting closer, and he is cycling faster and faster and faster until eventually he gets to the farm. And he says that this was the Banshee, that he knew what it was, he knew that it was unmistakable. It chased him on his bike, it terrified him. And I remember reading this book and reading this story and thinking, that sounds very similar to what me and my friend experience now. I still think that it was our imaginations as children, but it reminded me of that story and kind of brought it into the forefront of my mind, which I had clearly forgotten about as it was many years before. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting thing to tell. It's quite funny. But yeah, it's something that I look back on as a very strange experience as a kid. And it's funny how Irish mythology and folklore kind of seeps into the culture, especially as you're growing up here. So the last thing I want to do is I want to read you some stories that I found on Reddit. I will credit the people that these posts are from. I have saved them, or maybe I'll screenshot them, and we can read through them together. So I'm currently living with my sister, not too far off the south coast of Ireland. I fly back home in 3 hours, and I've been here about 3.5 weeks now. Thing is, her and her man got home from work around 1:30 a.m. around a week ago, and while me and my sister were outside, we heard these terrible screams coming from a field over the way from us. Over the way from us, I guess, is just a little bit away over there. Very Irish expression, I think. We didn't tell her man that first night because he wouldn't have believed us anyway, or would have said that it was a fox getting a chicken. But the next night he came running in after work, saying how he had seen a screaming lady in the field. Each night since, at 2 a.m.-ish, I've heard these screams, and if I stay up later, it progresses from screams into knocking at my window, her window, and the front door. I don't like that. Like I said, I fly home in a few hours. My flight is at 6:20 a.m. So I was staying awake all night as I have to set out at like 4 a.m. anyways. So I'm sitting here watching YouTube on my phone, and what do I hear? That damn screaming again. So immediately I grab my phone to record. It stops. Every single time I pull out my phone, the screaming stops. I'm sitting here with the only light on for miles being the light in the room that I am sitting in. I want to go outside to look, but it's pitch black with nothing but fields, and honestly, I'm actually a bit scared. I would be too. Yeah, that's it. Interesting, very interesting. I really don't like, I feel like I'd be able to accept the screams. As an ecologist, I'm fairly aware about our fauna that's found in Ireland, and I do know that I've heard owls at night, I've heard foxes screaming at night, and these sounds if you don't know what they are very, very jarring and very terrifying. So I feel like, as well as someone who does a lot of work with bats, and I spend a lot of time during the summer doing night work, I've built up a tolerance for the nighttime and the scary stuff. So sounds and stuff like that, I feel like I'd be able to get over, I'd be able to rationalize it in my head. But knocking at windows and doors is a no thank you for me. Okay, let's go to the next one. For those who have never heard of the Banshee, she is a figure of Irish folklore who is the forebringer of death. As a child, I remember my grandmother telling me that my grandfather had taken ill in the back room of their house. She was attending him when she heard a loud banging on the front door and left my grandfather to go and answer it. Don't answer it, don't answer it. She told me that as she approached the door, she could hear a sobbing noise coming from outside, but on opening the door, there was no one on the other side. She immediately went back to my grandfather, finding him stone dead in the bed. Fast forward to November 2001. I was in my grandmother's house. She had only been given a few days to live, and my father thought it was a good idea to come out and say my last goodbyes. I'm really sorry to this person. Rather unfortunately, she was going through a slow and painful death. I remember going to her bedroom and feeling very cold. I knew that the few days were more realistically a matter of hours at the most. That's very hard. As my grandmother's breathing became more shallow, my dad said it was probably better that I sit in the front room. He called my aunt's boyfriend and asked him to come and pick me up. While I was waiting, I heard a knock on the door. I assumed it was my aunt's boyfriend. As I approached the door, I could hear crying. As I touched the lock to open the door, I suddenly felt a big chill down my spine. There was no one there. Almost instantaneously, I heard a mixture of prayers and sobbing coming from the back room. I knew that she was gone. As I closed the door, I saw a glimpse of what can only be described as a tall, thin woman sitting, crying on the neighbor's wall. The experience has stayed with me forever. That is really, really, really scary. Yeah. I'm so sorry to this person. That's really, really difficult experience. But yeah, that's pretty scary, all right. I hate the knocking on the door. I hate it so much. I'm someone that does get quite scared being alone. We do live in a pretty isolated area. So a big fear of mine is hearing a knock on the door in the middle of the night. No, thank you. That door is staying well locked and I am staying away from it. So I was sitting in my living room scrolling through Reddit, as you do, and all of a sudden an ear-piercing shriek rung out. I freeze and immediately message my other half, who is upstairs. Did you hear that? He comes down and sees me ashen-faced, sitting frozen on the sofa. Our first thought is someone is hurt. We live in the middle of nowhere. Behind our house there are huge orchards and some woods, and not long ago there were 2 murdered women found in our area. Whew. One crime was very high profile in the UK and the other locally. We instantly worried that some poor woman was being attacked, so grabbed a torch and prepared to phone 999. Nothing outside. I was very shaken up, so other half went to the neighbours and adjoining house, and they didn't hear anything either. Not a peep. The neighbours on the other side who came out to fill his wheelie bin said the same. I was dumbfounded. It was so loud. It sounded like it was coming from inside the house. It was that loud. The neighbours suggested a fox. If anyone has heard mating foxes, you'll know that it sounds effing awful. But this was not a fox screech. I've heard them many times before, and it wasn't a cat either, nor the pipes. The telly was not on, and I wasn't listening to music or a podcast. It was a woman's scream. After ruling out logical things, I started to wonder whether it was paranormal. Although this thought had already crossed my mind because the scream instantly brought back a foul memory that I had tried very hard to repress. Many years ago, I lived with my mom. I saw through the living room window a car parked outside the house that I thought that I recognized. It looked like my granddad's car. There was a woman sitting in the back seat. I peered through the window to see if it was my man, aunt, or cousin. I was excited for an unannounced family visit. Then the woman, who did look a bit like my aunt, turned to look at me through the window. I could see then that her face was ashy grey. Her mouth opened unnaturally wide, with her jaw dropping further than it should be able to. Ugh. Ugh. Then, right in my ear, the loudest, shrillest scream I had ever heard. I dropped to the ground, out of sight of the window and the woman. Mum found me on the floor. I don't know how much time had passed, but I was too scared to move. The next morning, we get the news that Grandad had died in his sleep. Years later, I learn about the Banshee. For anyone that doesn't know, the Banshee is a figure in Irish and Welsh mythology. She is an omen of death. Before a death or bout of fatal illness or injury, she will appear to the forsaken person's family and scream or wail. I live in England, but my family are on both sides are Irish and on my father's side Welsh. I had heard the term Banshee but didn't know what it meant. I had only heard it used by older relatives who were describing a particularly unpleasant or shrill woman. Would you get a load of her squawking? Sounds like a bloody banshee. I can relate to that. I assumed it was an old-fashioned term for a noisy woman. There are a lot of those. It was only a few years later, when I got interested in mythology, that I found out what the term actually means and that I had encountered one. All right, I'm going to do one more. When I was 7 years old, we lived in a place called Dundrum, County Down in Ireland. I had never experienced anything ghostly, though at 7, I was afraid of just about everything. One night, I was laying in my bed, trying to fall asleep. I was lying on my back with my arms folded across my chest and the duvet up to my chin. The bed faced a small window in what we call the box room, which I feel like every Irish family has. It was around 8 foot by 6 foot. As I was trying to sleep, I felt a gust. I opened my eyes in time to see the curtains falling back into place. I got up from my bed to close the window. It opened out at the top while the bottom was a fixed sheet of glass. I stood back thinking how strange it was that the window was closed. I lay in bed occasionally peeking at the curtains. When nothing had happened for a while, I felt comfortable enough to keep my eyes closed. To my horror, I felt a huge gush. The curtains were nearly touching the ceiling. I lay there frozen, and I swear I wish this was all lies. The ugliest, most tatty, dressed in white, swept straight through the glass and hovered a couple of feet above my bed, staring at me. I tried to get up to run to my parents' room, but the ugly old was tightening the duvet around my neck. Oh my God, that's scary. I struggled with all of my might with my eyes closed, when somehow I managed to break free. I bolted down the hall and freaked out, waking my parents. My father was a very strict man. You not, he told me to grow up and marched me straight back to my room. I sat upright in the bed the rest of the night with the duvet over my head, sitting in a puddle of my own. If I could just remain silent, maybe the old woman would not hear me. I am 38 now, and all my children's lives have never and will never sleep with my bed facing a window. My wife knows why, as there is nothing I have not confided in her. Over the years, I have heard of a condition known as old hag syndrome. Even if that is what it was, it's no less terrifying to a 7-year-old. Back to the Banshee side, our surname begins with O-H. A few days after this horrific experience, my parents had a bad car crash. An oncoming speeding car hit black ice on a country road. My parents survived the collision, but my father was in hospital for 3 weeks. I wonder if it was an omen and the Banshee had sent a warning. I feel myself returning to that petrified 7-year-old and consoling him in my mind. Surely she will not return. So I think that's more than enough stories. I have been talking for ages, and I don't want this video to be really long, even though I think it probably will be. I really enjoyed making this different spooky type of video. It may not be plant related, but I hope that you enjoyed nonetheless. If you did enjoy it, please let me know. Either give a like or comment. I hope that you all have a really safe and fun Iha Hauna or Halloween. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.